September 1, 1943, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Subro Sakai, his left eye blown out a year earlier by American gunfire, held an intelligence brief that made him laugh in the humid operations tent. The Americans, he read, had introduced a new carrier fighter, large as a transport, heavy as a bomber, called the F6F Hellcat. Japanese analysts believed it weighed nearly twice as much as the A6M Zero. Sakai shook his head. Typical American overbuilding, he thought. Outside, rows of Zeros sat gleaming on the perforated steel runway, sleek, responsive, and undefeated in 2 full years of war. To every Japanese aviator present, this new Hellcat was just another American mistake waiting to be shot down. What no one realized was that exactly 30 days later, this mistake would begin exterminating Japanese naval aviation. The Hellcat would ultimately achieve a 19-to-1 kill ratio, down 5,223 Japanese aircraft, and lose only 270 in air combat. Within months, many pilots laughing during this morning briefing would be writing farewell letters, knowing that meeting a Hellcat meant near certain death. Japanese confidence in late 1943 wasn't based on arrogance, it was based on mathematics. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Navy had racked up impossible victories. At Pearl Harbor, Japan lost 29 planes while destroying 347. In the Philippines, they lost 7 and shot down 103. Over Darwin, only 2 aircraft were lost while 30 Allied planes fell. The Zero was the center of this storm. When the Allies tested a captured Zero in 1942, American engineers rejected the first performance readings. They thought the numbers were errors. A fighter with bomber-level range, feather-like control response, and brutal firepower? It made no sense. Japan's ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa described the Zero as if it were alive. Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. To Japanese pilots, American fighters, 40 Warhawks, Brewster Buffaloes, Hurricanes, were lumbering metal beasts. The Zero's miraculous performance came from a ruthless doctrine. Cut everything that adds weight. No armor behind the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Radios removed if needed. Its frame used extra super duralumin, a classified lightweight alloy that American engineers did not yet understand. Every gram saved meant tighter turns and faster climbs. Every gram removed also meant sacrificing survivability. Early 1943 intelligence reports on the new Hellcat were dismissed outright. The aircraft supposedly weighed 12,186 pounds loaded, compared to the Zero's 800 pounds. It carried heavy armor plating, bulletproof glass, and an enormous ammunition load. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of Pearl Harbor, reviewed the Hellcat specifications and rejected them in a written analysis. The Americans learned nothing. To him, the Zero's elegant turning combat rendered any heavy fighter irrelevant. The math appeared to agree. Zero turn radius around 612 feet, Hellcat predicted over 900 feet in a traditional turning dogfight. The Hellcat looked hopeless. September 30, 1943, Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui climbed through scattered clouds, escorting a reconnaissance aircraft when he spotted 6 dark blue shapes rising from the southeast. At first he mistook them for B-25 bombers flying an odd pattern, until the aircraft turned. The silhouette was wrong for any bomber. Short wings, massive fuselage, and an engine cowling far too large. Fukui recorded in his after-action notes, first sighting of the new American fighter. Following doctrine, he rolled into a tight diving turn, expecting the heavy American aircraft to continue forward and allow his Zero to slide neatly onto its tail. But what happened next defied everything Japanese pilots believed about American fighters. The Hellcat didn't attempt to turn. It went straight up, climbing vertically with a power the Zero couldn't hope to match. Its 2,000 horsepower R-2800 engine hauled the fighter skyward at over 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow, but his airspeed bled away immediately. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat pivoted into a clean hammerhead turn and dropped behind him. The American opened fire from 400 meters. Fukui wrote, "The volume of fire was unimaginable, 6 guns, not 4. His Zero was hit 17 times in seconds. Only by snapping into a spinning dive did he escape. His wingman Masao Sato never returned. Nor did the reconnaissance aircraft. It was the first small taste of what awaited Japan's air arm. October 5, 1943, attack on Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros of the 252nd Air Group to intercept what they assumed was another brief American probe. The skies below them held 12 F6F Hellcats flying in perfect three-section formation. Shiga believed the advantage was entirely his: altitude, surprise, and battle-tested pilots. In the past, that would have guaranteed victory. His men dove. The Hellcats didn't scatter or attempt horizontal evasive turns. They stayed in formation and preserved energy, dropping into a shallow dive that preserved speed. Shiga's Zeros fired at long range, hoping for early hits. But the American fighters simply absorbed the fire. Armor plates soaked up rounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks hissed and closed. Bulletproof glass shattered but held. As the Zeros overshot, the Hellcats reversed the fight. Climbing into thin air where the Zero's engine gasped for oxygen, they used altitude as a weapon. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still had over 1,600 horsepower. The Zero had barely 900. Shiga later wrote, "They fell upon us like hawks. Their weight was their speed. They struck and climbed away before we could react." 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. November 1943, Rabaul briefing. Pilots of the 204th Air Group gathered for instruction from Lieutenant Commander Tadeo Tanamizu, one of the few veterans who had survived encounters with Hellcats more than once. His briefing shattered decades of Japanese aerial doctrine. He told his pilots bluntly, "Forget everything you learned. The Americans no longer fight our battle. They fight a different war." Tanamizu described the new American strategy: energy fighting, high-speed slashing attacks instead of turning duels. Hellcats worked in coordinated pairs, one fighter high, one low, each covering the other's blind spots. Radios, which Japanese aviators had once mocked as unnecessary weight, now allowed American formations to fight as a synchronized machine. "We fly like samurai," he warned. "They fight like an automatic weapon." The room fell silent. Many of the men listening would not survive the next 6 months. December 1943, Truck Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, architect of Pearl Harbor, now oversaw air operations. When damaged Zeros returned from battles against Hellcats, he inspected the wreckage personally. What he found horrified him. The Zero's twin 7.7mm guns lacked stopping power. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber guns fired over 4,500 rounds per minute, each round delivering nearly 3,500 FTLBs of impact energy. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots were now reporting something entirely new: radar-directed interceptions. Hellcat pilots didn't stumble into combat. They were guided to the exact altitude, bearing, and approach angle by American shipboard radar controllers. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamichi described his first radar-assisted ambush. "We climbed through clouds. They appeared above us, perfectly positioned. They knew our altitude, our course, our speed." Japan's greatest fear had materialized. The Americans were fighting with a coordination system the Japanese simply did not possess. January 1944, the breaking point in pilot training. What had once been the world's most demanding aviation program was now collapsing under the pressures of war. Before 1943, Imperial Navy pilots trained for nearly 3 years, logging 700 flight hours, mastering aerobatics, formation flying, night operations, and live-fire gunnery. Army pilots received almost 500 hours of instruction. But by early 1944, the fuel shortages and the mounting pilot losses produced a disaster no Japanese commander could hide. New Navy pilots were arriving with barely 300 hours total flight time, many with far less. Army pilots were worse, averaging 200 hours, much of it in powerless gliders because aviation fuel was too precious to waste on training. Live gunnery drills had been reduced to a shocking minimum, 50 practice rounds per pilot. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, overseeing training at Kasumigaura Air Station, documented the collapse with brutal honesty. "We are sending children to fight professionals," he wrote. He noted that Ensign Yamamoto, newly sent to the front, had never once fired his guns in flight. There was simply no ammunition for training. Yamamoto lasted 7 minutes in his first engagement against Hellcats. Hashimoto ended his report with words that would haunt the Naval Air Staff. "We have run out of pilots, fuel, and time. Only hope remains, and hope is not a strategy." Open Book Rewritten Story, Part 3 Books Reference Summary, all 4 categories, January 1944, The Breaking Point in Pilot Training. What had once been the world's most demanding aviation program was now collapsing under the pressures of war. Before 1943, Imperial Navy pilots trained for nearly 3 years, logging 700 flight hours, mastering aerobatics, formation flying, night operations, and live-fire gunnery. Army pilots received almost 500 hours of instruction. But by early 1944, the fuel shortages and the mounting pilot losses produced a disaster no Japanese commander could hide. New Navy pilots were arriving with barely 300 hours total flight time, many with far less. Army pilots were worse, averaging 200 hours, much of it in powerless gliders because aviation fuel was too precious to waste on training. Live gunnery drills had been reduced to a shocking minimum, 50 practice rounds per pilot. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, overseeing training at Kasumigaura Air Station, documented the collapse with brutal honesty. "We are sending children to fight professionals," he wrote. He noted that Ensign Yamamoto, newly sent to the front, had never once fired his guns in flight. There was simply no ammunition for training. Yamamoto lasted 7 minutes in his first engagement against Hellcats. Hashimoto ended his report with words that would haunt the Naval Air Staff. "We have run out of pilots, fuel, and time. Only hope remains, and hope is not a strategy." Characters and units: Yoshihiro Hashimoto, Ensign Yamamoto, Ijin Training Squadrons, Japanese Army Pilot Schools, Major Events and Operations, Collapse of Pilot Training Programs, Fuel Shortages, Reducing Training Hours, Early 1944 Pilot Readiness Crisis, Locations: Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, Various Japanese Training Bases, Equipment and Systems, Lack of live ammo, 50 rounds. Fuel rationing, glider-based training, A6M0 frontline deployment, October 12 to 16, 1944, the Formosa disaster. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, leading the 2nd Air Fleet, launched a massive effort to stop the American carrier raids on Formosa. Over 700 Japanese aircraft, including the last high-quality pilots from the homeland training schools, rose to meet the American assault. When the first reports returned, Japanese headquarters erupted in celebration. Pilots claimed the destruction of 26 American carriers and battleships and 300 aircraft. Newspapers published the victory before the smoke had cleared. But when gun camera footage and pilot debriefs were analyzed, a horrifying truth emerged: the victory had been almost entirely imaginary. Actual American losses were 89 aircraft, nothing more. Japanese losses were 329 aircraft, many with their best surviving veterans aboard. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the rare elite pilots who lived through the battle, later wrote, "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. Above us, below us, behind us. They had divided the sky into squares, each one filled with an American fighter." The Japanese formations were broken apart and shredded before reaching effective range. The battle revealed the new reality. The Americans controlled the vertical, the horizontal, and the unseen battlefield of radar. Formosa was not just a defeat, it was the beginning of the final collapse of Japanese naval aviation. Late 1943, early 1944, the shift in air superiority becomes irreversible. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots were discovering a painful truth: the war had transformed into something their doctrine had never anticipated. The Americans now controlled the air detection network. Radar stations aboard carriers and picket ships could track Zeros from more than 50 miles away, vectoring Hellcats into perfect intercept positions. Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight and luck. The difference was lethal. Lieutenant Takamura Kamachi described watching Hellcats appear exactly at the altitude and heading they were attempting to hide in. "We believed we still had skill," he wrote. But how do you fight what can see through cloud, distance, and night? Radar removed chance from combat. It replaced it with mathematics. Japanese intelligence miscalculations become fatal. The pre-war faith in Zero superiority lingered far too long within senior Japanese command. Even as losses mounted, many officers still refused to believe American aircraft could be superior. The assumption was cultural, not analytical. Japanese pilots were believed to be inherently better, and thus their aircraft must be too. Commander Minoru Genda, who had once dismissed the Hellcat as a sluggish, overweight mistake, received more and more field reports describing American firepower and survivability. Still, the disbelief persisted. The Americans cannot have surpassed us so quickly. Worse, U.S. production meant Hellcats kept arriving, wave after wave, faster than Japan could shoot them down. The stage is set for the turning point. By early 1944, every trend pointed in one direction. Japan's air war was entering a phase it could not win. The Zero had not become worse. The Hellcat had evolved beyond it, supported by radar, training, fuel, and numbers the Japanese Empire could no longer match. In the coming months, the Mariana Islands would become the arena where Japanese aviation met industrial warfare and broke. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The combined fleet launched Operation AGO. The decisive engagement meant to crush American carrier power once and for all. Japan deployed 9 carriers and roughly 450 aircraft, many flown by the last generation of pilots with meaningful combat experience. Opposite them stood Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, nearly half of them F6F Hellcats. Long before the first Japanese formation neared the American fleet, radar screens aboard U.S. carriers lit up. The first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft was detected at 150 miles. Fighter direction officers began vectoring Hellcats into perfect intercept positions. Altitude advantage, sun behind them, approach angles matched precisely to the Japanese route. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort for the Japanese strike, described the scene as his force approached the interception point. The sky was stacked with Hellcats, from 20,000 to 30,000 feet. At least 60 of them waited like a metal wall. The battle was brutally one-sided. In just 12 minutes, Hellcats destroyed 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave. American pilots scarcely believed the ease of the kills. Many Japanese aviators failed to take evasive action at all. They simply had too little training to exploit the Zero's once legendary maneuverability. By day's end, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft and 50 land-based aircraft, while American losses totaled just 30 aircraft. That night, in the ready rooms of Task Force 58, pilots coined the name that would define the battle forever: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Hellcat's tactical supremacy on full display. Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15, was one of the key architects of the devastating American performance. Using high-side attacks and strict energy discipline, his pilots refused to enter turning fights, stripping the Zero of its only remaining advantage. McCampbell himself shot down 7 aircraft on June 19. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. McCampbell's combat report stated plainly, "The enemy attempted to turn. We no longer accepted those fights. We made slashing passes, regained altitude, and waited for them to stall." The Japanese fighters, often piloted by men with under 150 hours of training, couldn't maintain energy or situational awareness. The result was systematic destruction. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. McCampbell would break another record during the largest naval battle in history. Leading just 7 Hellcats from the carrier USS Essex, he intercepted a massive formation of 60 Japanese aircraft headed toward the American fleet. The battle lasted 90 minutes. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, becoming the only U.S. pilot to achieve ace in a day status twice. Rushing destroyed 6 more aircraft. Astonishingly, the American formation suffered no losses. McCampbell later wrote, "Not a single round struck my aircraft. The Hellcat gave me every advantage a pilot could want. The engagement marked a pivotal moment, where 7 Hellcats could rout 60 Japanese planes with near mathematical certainty. Psychological collapse of Japanese aviation. After the Marianas and Leyte Gulf, Japanese pilots coined a grim new phrase, Hellcat syndrome. The fear was not simply of the aircraft, but of the system behind it: radar direction, disciplined tactics, training, and overwhelming production. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the carrier force during the Philippine Sea Battle, summarized the crisis in his after-action report. The Americans have mechanized aerial combat. Each Hellcat is only a part of a machine. Our pilots, no matter their valor, face not individuals but a system. The collapse in pilot skill compounded the crisis. By early 1945, Navy pilots were receiving just 40 to 50 hours of flight time before combat. Many kamikaze pilots had fewer than 7 total days of training. Japan's remaining veterans understand the war is lost. Survivors of multiple Hellcat encounters, men like Lieutenant Tadeo Tanamizu and Ace Sadaki Akamatsu, attempted to warn command that the war had changed beyond recovery. But fuel shortages, industrial collapse, and the deaths of elite pilots made the situation irreversible. The skies had become a domain dominated not by skill, but by industry, technology, and coordination. By mid-1944, the Zero, once a symbol of Japanese aerial supremacy, had become a relic fighting a machine it was never designed to oppose. Early 1945, Japan turns to kamikaze warfare. With its veteran aviators nearly extinct and its training system collapsing, the Imperial Japanese Navy shifted to a strategy of desperation, turning its remaining aircraft into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, founder of the kamikaze program, justified the change in brutally direct terms. If a Zero attacks in conventional combat, it will be destroyed. If it becomes a bomb, the chance of success increases. The pilot dies either way. The tactic reflected a grim reality. Japan no longer possessed pilots capable of competing with Hellcat formations. The skies that once housed elite Japanese airmen were now filled with teenagers who had fewer than 40 hours of flight time before their final mission. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace, meets a bitter fate. The tragedy of Japan's decline was embodied in the final flights of Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the celebrated ace with 80-plus claimed victories. Modern research suggests 87. On October 25, 1944, he escorted Japan's first official kamikaze strike. He scored 2 kills, both Hellcats, briefly proving he still possessed unmatched skill. But the next day, Nishizawa was ordered to travel as a passenger aboard a transport bound for Luzon. The aircraft was intercepted and shot down by VF-14 Hellcats, ending the life of Japan's greatest living fighter pilot. His last combat victory and his death occurred within 24 hours, a symbolic collapse of Japanese air power. Operation Iceberg, the Battle for Okinawa, April-June 1945. Against the American fleet off Okinawa, Japan launched 1,900 kamikaze sorties, the largest suicide air campaign in history. Hellcats became both sword and shield, intercepting incoming aircraft long before they reached the U.S. naval screen. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, flying his Flying Circus division of Hellcats, pioneered new mass engagement tactics, for F6Fs sweeping across Japanese formations in line abreast, cutting through waves of attackers with disciplined bursts. Hellcats flew 38,038 sorties during the campaign, destroying 2,351 Japanese aircraft for the loss of only 249. Approximately 80% of kamikaze aircraft were stopped before reaching their targets, numbers that made the collapse of Japanese aviation inevitable. The technology gap becomes a chasm. By 1945, the F6F Hellcat had evolved even further. The F6F5 variant added water injection boost, raising engine output to 2,200 horsepower. It carried zero-length rocket launchers, improved armor, and the K-14 computing gun sight, which automatically calculated deflection angles. Japanese engineers studying wrecked Hellcats found levels of precision manufacturing far beyond their nation's wartime ability. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, examined a captured Hellcat and delivered a sober verdict. We built an aircraft for 1941. They built an aircraft system for 1945. The Zero's once astonishing agility no longer mattered. It was outclassed in horsepower, firepower, survivability, and radar coordination. The industrial miracle behind the Hellcat. Japan's factories were collapsing under bombing and fuel shortages. Meanwhile, Grumman's Bethpage plant in New York operated continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak output, one new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour. In just 30 months, Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats, a number Japan could not dream of matching. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced 35,000 fighters, while Japan produced all types combined, 5,100. Every part of the Hellcat, from its R-2800 engine to its interchangeable components, reflected a standardization and industrial strength Japan lacked entirely. A strategic revolution in naval warfare. The Hellcat changed not only battles but doctrine. Before the war, naval theory insisted that carriers had to strike first or be destroyed. The Hellcat allowed the opposite. Carriers became floating fortresses. Admiral Mark Mitcher summarized this shift: "Let them come. The Hellcat will dispose of them." With radar detection and disciplined fighter direction, U.S. carriers could remain on station indefinitely. Offensive operations expanded, and American fleets operated off enemy shores with unprecedented confidence. Japan had entered the war believing in the supremacy of elite warrior pilots. It ended the war facing a mechanized, coordinated, industrialized system that rendered its philosophy obsolete. August 15, 1945. The war ends. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the last remnants of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service gathered at Atsugi Airfield in stunned silence. Among them was Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant strategist who had once helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack and who had dismissed the Hellcat as overbuilt and clumsy. Around him stood teenage pilots with barely 40 hours of flight time. Their aircraft were worn, underfueled, and obsolete, symbols of a force that had been shattered not only in battle but in spirit. That same afternoon, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31 shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy that was still approaching the American fleet, unaware of the surrender. It became the final aerial victory of World War II. The Hellcats land in Japan. In early September 1945, the first American aircraft to touch down on Japanese soil were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots and mechanics gathered to inspect the machines that had destroyed their air arm. Lieutenant Robert Bob Vov, a 19-victory ace, demonstrated the Hellcat's performance, rolling, looping, and climbing with casual ease. Japanese observers were stunned. The maneuvers would have torn a Zero apart. "This is not even full power," Vov told them through an interpreter. "In combat, we squeeze 20% more from the engine." To pilots who had spent years trusting the Zero's agility, seeing the Hellcat perform with such effortless strength was a profound psychological blow. Post-war engineering analysis. Japan confronts reality. Japanese engineers were granted access to captured Hellcats for technical study. The findings were devastating. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine contained 2,884 precision machine parts, each interchangeable with any other engine of the same type. The Zero's Najima Sakai engine, by contrast, required hand-fitting for many components. No two engines were identical. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, conducted a thorough inspection and concluded, "We designed a superior fighter for 1941, but they created an industrial system for 1945. We perfected the blade. They built the factory that makes the blade better every month." The production verdict: industry as a weapon. The Allies discovered that Grumman had produced 12,275 Hellcats in just 30 months, almost one every 60 minutes. Japan produced far fewer Zeros in the same period, and most were inferior late-war variants. In 1944, the United States produced 35,000 fighters, compared to Japan's total of 5,100 across all aircraft types. The Japanese were stunned to learn that U.S. factories operated continuously in color-coded shifts and held massive stockpiles of standardized parts. Their own aircraft assembly relied heavily on handcrafting and scarce materials. Post-war analysts concluded that no amount of Japanese pilot bravery could compensate for this industrial gulf. The strategic legacy, a new vision of warfare. The Hellcat didn't merely outperform the Zero, it reshaped naval warfare. Radar-directed interception, disciplined energy tactics, and overwhelming production created a system where the individual pilot, even a skilled one, counted for less than the machine supporting him. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who watched his carrier force annihilated at the Philippine Sea, later summarized this transformation: "We did not lose to pilots. We lost to an industrial machine." With the Hellcat, the U.S. Navy no longer relied on surprise or elite maneuvering. It relied on coordination, scale, radar visibility, and the mathematics of modern war. Final judgment: Saburo Sakai's last words. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, lived until 2000. In one of his final interviews, he was asked whether he believed the Zero or the Hellcat was the superior aircraft. His answer encapsulated the entire Pacific Air War. The Zero was a magnificent fighter, but the Hellcat was part of a greater weapon. We brought the spirit of the samurai. They brought an industrial civilization. That is why they won. For Sakai and the few veterans who lived long enough to reflect, the lesson was painfully clear. The Hellcat did not simply defeat Japan's fighters. It dismantled a philosophy of combat that could not survive the age of mechanized, mass-produced warfare.